Okay, good evening. If I start walking towards that lemonade, by the way, if someone can stop me, because otherwise it will go straight over. So good evening, I'm Jonathan. I wrote an app that is being used in Africa, and this talk is essentially just a rundown of the things that I learned through that process. And I'm still very much learning through it. There are things that I look back on and think, idiot, that was obvious, why did you do it that way? And there are other things that I'm sure are going to bite me at some point. This is not my day job. My day job is actually working in cybersecurity for some local authorities. So this is what I do when I'm not at work, which I guess makes me one of those people who just doesn't unplug at any point. I've been developing applications in varying languages for years. Started off in Microsoft Quick Basic, which I think, Sam, you might have given me the discs for originally. So started there, didn't do anything massively productive with that, but had a go. Messed around a bit and carried on, write some web apps and still do that now, but a lot of the web apps that I've written I've never actually had more than 10 users on because they're small systems used for very specific purposes. So that's where I started. My long-time coding partner is in the room. I'm not going to look at them because I've been told I can't point them out, but it's quite nice being on a journey and having the same person with you for over 12 years and developing together. So I started working with a charity called African Pastors Fellowship, and they had this vision. The CEO came to me and he said, I want to write an app for our partners in Uganda and other parts of sub-Saharan Africa where they can download resources. And then he said, and I have no idea what I've just asked you. Is it possible? So they're a Christian charity. They want to transform lives out there, so they do stuff on farming, some Christian materials, different studies. There might be financial suggestions in there as well for them to try and help change their community, and that's where they're interested in. They're actually wanting to change the community. But the problem was everything has been sent out previously on paper. And of course the problem with paper is it doesn't update itself. Once it's out there, it's out there. So it's expensive to print, it's a write once document, and then they print it normally in this country and they would ship it out to Africa. And because Africa is a big place, my geography is awful, but that one I've managed to grasp. It means that getting it around Africa is an absolute nightmare, because they might land it with a partner in Uganda, but they have other groups in Rwanda and Malawi that they do work with, and of course they've then got to get that to those partners. But transportation in Africa is not as good as it is here, let's put it politely. You could end up in a traffic jam in Soroti, for example, and you would be there for an hour and move 5 feet. You really don't have much hope if you want to get something shipped quickly. So you would resort to something like a man on a motorbike. And it is generally a man on a motorbike in this case. And they'll go out, they'll pick up the stuff, and they will ride for hours to make their delivery, and then they'll come back. And some of our colleagues have actually been on the back of one of those, and that can be quite a hair-raising experience. So paper was a problem, and they acknowledged that. So they wanted to improve on things. They still actually have containers of paper out in Africa that just isn't being used. It might be in a local language that you can travel a few kilometres up the road, it'll be a different language. So it can have a very niche audience for the different things they print. I'm guessing somebody's sub is descending there. That's okay. So the solution was an app. And this is what the CEO hadn't really understood he'd asked. Out in Africa, you don't tend to find many iPhones, which from my perspective is great because I'm not an iPhone user. I wouldn't have the first clue where to start developing with that. So we went with Android, and a lot of them don't necessarily have their own Android device. During the launch conference, it was quite interesting. It was a 50-50 split of people that had a smartphone and people who just had essentially a copy of a Nokia, who would then say, can I get the app on this? So that was quite interesting. But we had to obviously make the app easy to use, and it had to be an interface that didn't necessarily require English, as I'll come on to in a bit. Oh, volume. So that's roughly what it looks like at the moment. It is going to change, because initially the plan was you can have the logo of the contributor on there, and apparently the end user will know what each of these people do. I don't know what half of these people do. And it was discussed recently how actually that wasn't working. So we've got to change that to be based on topics. So they might have one that's about farming, or one that's about children or about health. So that will be changing. So that's one challenge, is in order to update this, we've obviously got to get that update out there. We could have users that never update that app from when we launched it in March last year. So the interface is searchable to make it even easier. You could put any search term in there. You could search for a keyword that's tagged on the actual content, a part of the title, or the language itself. But importantly, once you've downloaded that resource, it's on your tablet. And that's a big problem that we have out in Africa, is that you haven't got internet everywhere. Their 4G is actually better than ours when you've got it. Whereas here, we might have a bit of patchy, we might drop down to 3G or what have you. That's not the case out there. So the users register for that, and then they can download that and do bits and pieces. So this is roughly what it looks like. The user has registered, they've logged in, they query a list of resources in XML, comes back, they then ask for a specific resource, and that comes down to their tablet. Which from my perspective is really easy until you start considering how dodgy some of their connections can be. So that speed and connectivity issue was our first hurdle. The transfer rates can be really slow, and we're talking 10 plus minutes to download 3 meg. So those in the room that remember dial-up, it's familiar territory, just without the lovely modem noises. And out there they pay for their data very much by the megabyte. You will actually go to a kiosk, you will buy essentially a top-up voucher for 100 meg, 500 meg, you'll text that to a number and then that's your data. So obviously we were very conscious that we didn't want to be wasting their data. They don't have the same disposable funds as we have, so it needs to work, and it needs to work reliably. Add to that, the connections may not be stable. They could try and download one video and find they have to request it several times. And early on, we had logging really quite verbosely, not thinking quite how bad this would be. And I would end up with just pages and pages of logs where someone's tried to download one video and it's sent the request over and over again. That obviously increases their costs, doesn't really affect ours as a charity. Yes, there is obviously a download cost for our hosting, but nowhere near what they were paying. So we have to make our downloaded data as small as possible. Now, some of you will quite rightly say, but that's a valid thing to do all the time. Absolutely agree. But obviously for them, that's really, really key. And as a result, we've had to build extra features in to compress that data, because unlike your browser, which will automatically say, yes, I support gzip, send me a compressed page, the app doesn't automatically, which was one of the learning curves for me. We didn't think about that, because we're too used to working with the browser itself, so we had to build that in. So those early versions of the app sent loads of requests. Every time you changed screen in the Android app, known as an activity, it would send another request, another login, another download of stuff. And initially the app had no caching either. And I spent quite a long time one day, and my coding buddy was with me, and we were looking at why this thing was so slow. What was going on? I'd just imported 2,000 items, which doesn't really sound like a lot, but our test environment was 20 pieces of content. And all of a sudden that 2,000 had gone in, and the app it was like wading through treacle. So we were caching stuff on the web server, making the database cache as well, and in the end that wasn't the answer. The answer was the caching in the app itself. So we now cache everything that we send to the app for 5 minutes. Now realistically we can increase that, because unless a member of the team is actively making changes, it's not going to make any difference whether they're looking at a list of content that's 5 minutes old or 30 minutes old. So the plan will be to increase that. As I said, initially there was no compression, so we've built that into the app, and the searching process was where the bottleneck really was. And it would take that XML file, and you'd type in one character, and I have no idea why we built it like this. You type one character, it would search through for that one character, which when it's the letter A, E or S, you're out straight away. Second letter, it would do the whole thing again, and it would just keep on. So we changed that. Now it will only do that if you've got 3 characters in there. It won't search otherwise, but importantly it will search off of that cache. So we've really tidied things up there. So I learned a lot about scaling and how my test environment needs to have more than 20 records in it. Contextualization was another issue. I'm what they would call a Mzungu. I'm a white man. And that means that what I consider to be important, or how I would perceive a thing, will be different to our end users. So we might, in the room, look at a triangle on a button. Any offers? Triangle? Oh dear. Hopefully it's play. Yep, thank you, Sam. And 2 horizontal bars, vertical bars will be pause. To some of our users, they will have never come across those symbols because it's just not something they have in their home. We've had VCRs, DVD players. A lot of the time our end users don't have those things. So we have to be careful. Any symbols we put on there, if they can't be understood, they're not offensive straight away. So we try and contextualise the interface. We've got some sort of power users out in various African countries, and they will focus on looking at things and going, this doesn't make sense, this is too complicated. So we're very aware that we are developing from a Western context. There's a difference in language as well. I said you could travel a few kilometres up the road and you'd be speaking a different language. I got bitten by this. I was in Uganda. I had learned a whole 3 words of a language called Teso. I went into a cafe and I asked the person serving me, how do you say 3 beers please in Teso? Just because that's the thing that we all learn, isn't it? You go to school and you learn how many beers. I don't drink beer. It was a completely pointless question for me. And she looked at me funny. She wasn't from the Teso region, which is where I was. She was from a couple of kilometres up the road and had come to work that day. So language is a real problem. English is the common language out there. But if I was speaking this fast, I would lose everybody in the group. So we've got to make sure everything is really sort of bolted down, makes sense. I have no idea how I'm doing for time, Alex.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, I'm on time. So we have to fix the contextualisation problem. And then when it comes to actually supporting the users, that's another hurdle. The first launch conference that we did was in March last year. I went out there. First problem we had was we had no tables. Second problem was we had no internet because it hadn't been delivered yet. So we had to get over that. And at least then, I was out there having built the system. My co-author didn't come out with us. So at least he was back home if I had a problem. But we then had this wonderful 3 days where I could sit down with you, I could say, this is how you do this, take feedback straight away. Of course, I'm not out there now. A lot of the time I'm sat in an office in Canterbury. Unfortunately, I work flexi time because occasionally I'll get an email from the CEO going something has gone wrong. And I can then stop and look at that. So I get a lot of email and WhatsApp queries. And I can assure you, by the time you get dumped in a chat with 15 people trying to use something they've possibly travelled for hours to try and use, you get bombarded with a lot of messages. So that is quite a big problem to actually get over. So we try and make things easier, obviously, to avoid that problem, but that's an ongoing process. We've got local partners out there. So the CEO was out there recently, he had some local IT support. Great from one perspective, because there's somebody more technical than him, because he hasn't got a clue how this works. But they got dumped into the WhatsApp chat as well. So I was then being bombarded with technical questions that were unfortunately slowing me down when I should have been doing something else. We got there, and actually hopefully he's going to be a really useful local asset and he's going to do some development with us too. Because he clearly knows things, it's just you've got to get over that language barrier. The problem was his team had taken a shortcut. We basically say you must install via the Play Store because that will be the latest version of the app and it will be the smallest version because we're now using Android app bundles. It did grow to 19 meg, which was crazy, and I never found out why, but Android app bundles solved the problem. The shortcut they took was they downloaded a copy of the Android file and then shared it via Bluetooth. So the day that I was trying to troubleshoot stuff at work with none of my normal kit, they were using an old version of the app that we knew had bugs, that didn't work with Android 5, which was what they were trying to use. It was a nightmare. So the shortcuts can be quite an issue. That said, at least now we know they do that. I got sent 3 reports after that particular launch conference. I didn't know they were coming. And it was quite interesting to see how another person's mind from a different context worked and the things they did and how they tried to get around problems. So that was really quite handy. We've got a problem when it comes to changing the back end. Now Chris spoke a while ago about technical debt and I'm really hoping I haven't accrued loads in this project, otherwise I'm coming and talking to you, Chris. When we built the system we knew that some of these tablets we would never see again. Because the first tranche we gave a tablet to. And we might never see those again. Only one's been stolen, which is incredible actually, out of 57 we gave out. So we know where the other 56 are, but they might never update. But the charity's goal is that they can access content and they can use content. So I've got to be really careful. Anything I change still works with an old version. Eventually, I'm going to have to cut them off. So we designed the schema that we were putting out on that XML to be as robust as possible, to include stuff that we believed we would be using, and the app itself will actually sit there and go, have I got a field called this? Yes, excellent, I'll process it, otherwise it will just ignore it. So we have got that flexibility, fortunately. But that backward compatibility at some point will have to die. So that's my key sort of problems and learning points for this project. Has anybody got any questions?